This video is about the governance structure of Wikipedia. In particular, who has power, how is that organized, why does it matter, all that stuff we're going to talk about in this video. So first of all, why is it important for us to think this through? And I actually think this is pretty important if we want to think about how online institutions are going to evolve over the future. We know that online is a really good space for people to collaborate, people from different backgrounds, from different parts of the world, and yet, for collaboration to work, you need structure to the community. You need expectations, you need norms, you need incentives of various types. And Wikipedia is just one of the most successful, if not the most successful example of people collaborating to produce a product that's free. So understanding how that could possibly happen, what are the incentives at play, what's the structure that makes that work, that makes that credible, those are just forces that we all should be thinking about more if we want to know where are institutions going in the future. Okay, and if we're going to talk about the governance of Wikipedia, we might first ask the question, why do we even need governance for Wikipedia? And if you're as old as I am, you can remember a time when teachers did not allow their students to cite Wikipedia as a source. Over time, it's become a much more credible source. So if we're talking about governance, we really want to know what are the rules that make sure Wikipedia has high quality content, that when there's trolls going in and making trouble, that content gets deleted, such that when you go to a page, you can kind of trust that a troll isn't playing a joke on you with the information they're giving. And it's not just trolls. I mean, there were a lot of teenage boys making jokes on Wikipedia in the early 2000s, but now there's actually a lot more organizations that are sort of trying to edit Wikipedia to edit the image of their company or the image of their person. For example, if it's a public speaker, they sort of want to be the ones to curate the information out there about them. And if you allow too much of that, the information may no longer be credible. So there has to be a good source of governance that makes sure the good and accurate information is much more likely to bubble to the top of what people see on Wikipedia. And this is particularly true since the philosophy of Wikipedia is to allow anyone to edit. There's no hierarchy based on credentials. If you have a degree from Harvard, that doesn't put you ahead of an editor who has a degree from the local community college or no college degree at all. And the lack of credentials, the fact that your reputation in editing is based on your merit on the platform rather than your merit through outside institutions such as Harvard and Princeton and Yale, that is a core part of the philosophy of Wikipedia. So there needs to be a powerful internal way for Wikipedia to figure out which editors do you trust and how do you know when to roll back the edits that someone's made. And we probably need to face it, the more power Wikipedia has in defining reality in the world, the more people are going to try to gain that power, perhaps for their own political purposes and perhaps for economic reasons, but there needs to be powerful structures to protect against that. Alright, so how is Wikipedia actually organized? Well, this diagram gives you a general sense of how it's organized, and you can tell that it's fairly complex. There's lots of committees and roles and responsibilities within Wikipedia, and each of those sort of check and counter-check the power of the others. And I'm going to go through the different parts of this diagram coming up, but I think it's helpful for you to think about this in terms of the way that organizations naturally evolve. For example, churches. Someone might start a church that just has a pastor, but as the church grows, there's more responsibilities, more people who need to collect the money, decide how to spend the money, decide who visits sick people in the hospital, organize the volunteers, the more structure you need to make sure those things work efficiently. And that's also true in Wikipedia. So there's going to be a lot of similarities to the governance of churches, the governance of nonprofit organizations, the governance of corporations, and the governance of countries. It's like in a small business, everybody does everything. The CEO wears a whole bunch of different hats because there's only a few people to share those roles. As you add more people, as you get bigger, those roles get more specialized such that each person has one role that they get really good at and they check each other's power. Alright, so just to start to understand this diagram, let's look at the different parts, and let's separate out the reddish parts from the bluish parts on this diagram, where the bluish parts are going to represent the broader Wiki movement, and that includes other organizations that are non-Wikipedia. So I'm going to focus less on the blue parts for this particular video, but I will talk a little bit about the Wikimedia Foundation, which is where your money goes if you donate to Wikipedia. So that's going to encompass buying servers to store the information and kind of the background business of making sure Wikipedia stays up and running. So this section here is really the part of Wikipedia that keeps the lights on. But the parts of this diagram in red are really where the interesting governance structure works, because this determines who gets to remove other people's edits, who has power within the organization, and how are those relationships organized. So the most common person with power on Wikipedia are the admins. And the admins combine with the bots to form the bureaucrats. And of course the bots are written by somebody. Someone writes up the code that goes and automatically does certain cleanup tasks. So these groups together have certain privileges. The admins can delete information forever, and the reason they need to do that is if someone posts private information about people, doxing for example, or if they post copyrighted information that can get the organization in trouble, or libelous information. So deleting information is one privilege of administrators. They can also block users, they can unblock users, they can edit certain protected pages. The admins are essentially the moderators of the community. And now it's worth noting that these are all volunteers. None of them are paid, they all volunteer their time, just like people volunteer their time in a church. So you might ask, how does a person become an admin? Well, basically you apply to become an admin, and the other admins get together and make a decision about that based on your past history, their experience of you in the community, their experience of your good behavior as an editor. So there is a power structure in place. It's based on merit, and that merit is judged by the current community of admins. So a lot of the action in terms of governance of the Wikipedia community happens in the admin group. But of course, there's going to be things that you wouldn't want too many people to be able to do. For example, check users. The check users can actually go in and look at the location of a particular person who's editing Wikipedia. So that's private information, it's geographic information. You wouldn't want an entire community of many admins to be able to do that because it could violate people's privacy, it could put people at risk. So you want to limit the number of people with that particular power, and so that's defined as a different role and one that requires a lot more trust from the community to have that responsibility. And those people are called the check users. They're also volunteers, there's just many fewer of them than there are admins. Now of course there could be disputes within the admins that need some kind of arbitration from a higher up power. And in general, that power is going to be the Arbitration Committee. Now, it should be said that Wikipedia encourages people to resolve disputes on their own. As a matter of fact, if you poke around the Wikipedia pages, they have a whole bunch of recommendations for how different users, including editors, just people who go in to edit the Wikipedia, and also admins, should try to resolve disputes on their own. So for example, if you go to this page on Wikipedia, it talks about what are some good ways to resolve disputes between different members of the Wikipedia community, and that includes bringing in a third opinion, asking the community for their opinion, having a moderated discussion. So they try to build a culture of collaboration, a culture where there doesn't always need to be someone from a higher level of the power structure coming in to resolve disputes. They really want the community to be able to resolve disputes on their own. And that's part of the culture that's formed within Wikipedia. So that's an interesting thing about the governance of Wikipedia, is that it relies heavily not just on the official power structure, but also the social norms for participation in the community. The admins of Wikipedia try to foster a culture that isn't people constantly fighting. It's where when conflict arises, which it's naturally going to do in almost any community, that conflict can get resolved through social norms, through values that the community holds about how to resolve conflict, rather than giving too much power to the arbitration committee. But occasionally you will need dispute resolution in a group like the arbitration committee. The arbitration committee is actually elected. It's elected annually by the members of the Wikipedia community. And anyone can run. These are also volunteers, but they're going to resolve the bigger disputes that sort of rise up within the system. They're like the Supreme Court of Wikipedia. And the arbitration committee can issue sanctions, and they can determine who gets what responsibilities and rights within the administration community. For example, who gets to be a check user. Now, if we come over here on the diagram, we see the stewards. And these are sort of high up officials who try to make sure that the community is running smoothly. And that, of course, includes social norms. Now, there aren't many stewards. There's actually only 39 the last time I checked this. And in the whole world, that's not that many people for this particular role. And the stewards basically have the highest privileges. They can even change technical aspects of Wikipedia. They can change user rights. They can change the interface of Wikipedia. They can change what administrators are allowed to do. And the stewards are also elected. So you notice that there's a bit of a checks and balances thing going on here. We have the arbitration committee that's elected. We have the stewards that are elected, and neither of them is over each other. So they have different roles, but the power of each of those groups counterbalances the other. And of course, you have to meet certain requirements to even run for those offices. Now, these are all volunteers, keep in mind. For example, to even run to be a steward, you have to have edited in the community for a certain length of time, and you need to have made a certain number of edits so that you've developed an understanding of the culture of Wikipedia and an understanding of sort of how the rules and social norms work together in the community. And I keep mentioning social norms here because that's kind of part of the governance of any community. It's not just the official rules. As a matter of fact, Wikipedia tries not to have too many official rules. They want the community to be governed by the norms and expectations of people who are committed to the values of the Wikipedia project. So the culture of the current administrators kind of makes up what Wikipedia is and the values they live out. And this includes things like don't bite the newbies, be nice to people who are coming in and don't yet understand the culture of Wikipedia, assume good faith when you're trying to work out conflicts with other users of Wikipedia, other editors. Ignore the rules is one thing that they made kind of a norm, which is they didn't want the rules of Wikipedia to bog people down and stop them from editing. They really wanted the editing to happen, and a gentle approach to sort of governing the quality of the material to be how things played out, rather than strict adherence to rules, which could attract really pedantic people who could kind of take over and make editing Wikipedia a bad experience, which would mean it wouldn't get updated, and that would be destructive to the community, etc., etc. So those are some of the social norms that have evolved in Wikipedia over time. Now, it's worth noting that these social norms differ by the Wikipedia community. For example, the Japanese language Wikipedia and the German language Wikipedia and the English language Wikipedia all have different social norms within their communities. Now, norms can be encoded into philosophies that guide the community, because having philosophies down on paper helps new members come into the community and understand what values are we trying to live up to. So there's really three types of written rules that help with this. One is essays. And here are a couple of examples of essays, what they look like. They just look like Wikipedia pages, but they're non-authoritative. They can't be referenced to sanction someone. They're just really trying to orient people to the values that Wikipedia is trying to uphold. The second type of rule is guidelines. And these actually are actionable norms. If you violate one of these, a mod can come in and say, don't do that, I'm going to undo your edit, or if you do it often enough, you could end up getting kicked out of the community. And these are approved by the general consensus of the community. And the third type of rule is a policy. And the policies have wide acceptance among the administrators, and everybody is expected to follow the policies. So the three basic policies are neutral point of view, verifiability, and no original research. And by the way, I did a lot of research for this video by reading the book The Wikipedia Revolution by Andrew Lee. So I highly recommend this book if you're interested in these topics. So that's basically how Wikipedia works. It's who has power within the organization. Now, one really interesting page about this is this page, which lists the way that Wikipedia is a bit of a mixture of all these types of power structures. Anarchy, precedent, bureaucracy, despotism, democracy, republic, meritocracy, plutocracy, and technocracy. And to oversimplify things a little bit, what is each of these things? Anarchy is when nobody has power. Precedent is when people have power who are doing what's been done before, people who adhere to tradition. Bureaucracy is when the people who have power are people who are deeply embedded in the organizational structure who are not elected. And these people, of course, understand how things work from the inside of the organization, which is one source of their power. Despotism is when a single powerful person has power. The benevolent dictator is an example of this, and of course, Jimmy Wales, one of the founders of Wikipedia, would have originally been more or less a benevolent dictator, although over time that's changed. Democracy is where everyone has power. Republic is where people who have power are people who are elected by the people. Meritocracy is where the people who have power are people who have proven themselves to be the most competent. Plutocracy is where the people who have the most power are the people who pay the most. Technocracy is where the people who have power are the people who understand the technology the best. So Wikipedia is a bit of a mixture of all of these. And let's just look briefly at why we might make each of these claims. Let's start backwards. So it's somewhat true on almost any online platform that the developers who developed sort of how the platform works, who can edit things, who can override things, the actual technology behind that is really powerful. So if you know how to work that technology, you can hack it. So there is a bit of technocracy involved. Plutocracy, how is it possible that people who pay the most have the most power? Well, I mean, Wikipedia involves editing, and anyone can edit, and we as users and also the administrators don't know if one of the editors is being paid to edit it in a certain way. So someone really rich could go out and pay a whole bunch of people to try to edit certain things that make their company look good or that support their political beliefs. And that's certainly something that could happen, that could give more power to people with the money. Meritocracy, of course, happens in this community because the people who get approved as admins are people who have sort of proven themselves in the community based on their editing skills. Since other admins are the ones to approve new admins, the community of admins is sort of responsible for maintaining that meritocracy. How are there features of a republic in the Wikipedia community? Well, the Arbitration Committee and also the Stewards, these are people who are elected by the entire community of people in Wikipedia. How are there democratic principles in Wikipedia? Well, the fact that anyone can actually go in and edit, that power lies with literally anyone who wants to go on and try to edit it. That's a bit democratic. Now, I should mention here as an asterisk that Wikipedia is not a democracy. It's not an experiment in a democratic structure on the internet. As a matter of fact, there's a whole page on what Wikipedia is not that's meant to debunk some misconceptions, and one of the misconceptions it debunks is Wikipedia is a democracy. It specifically says Wikipedia is not a democracy. But these principles are really just things that show up a little bit in the governance structure of Wikipedia. With despotism, I already mentioned that Jimmy Wales was originally a bit of a benevolent dictator. He made sure that the community got off to the right start, that the original set of editors and administrators shared his values and had this shared vision. And that's oftentimes true in these communities, where you need people who are very committed to a certain set of values and principles to make the community work to begin with, and then once that community begins to gain trust and regard, then that group of people can be responsible for making sure that people who come into the community adhere to those values and uphold those values. Why is there bureaucracy in Wikipedia? Well, I mean, the bigger Wikipedia gets, the more potential there is for people who really understand the quirks of how the community works, how the organization works, to potentially abuse power or use power in ways that were not necessarily intended. And not all bureaucracy is necessarily bad, it just means that people who are embedded in the system can change it more easily, can influence the way the community enacts its rules more easily than people who are newbies. Precedent is pretty important since Wikipedia didn't want to rely on a whole bunch of rules, so making decisions requires what decision was made before, and if you're not sure about a decision, looking back at previous similar decisions is one of the ways that the admins try to negotiate. And anarchy, well, that's just a fun word to add into the mix, but it's the idea that nobody has power, that we sort of let everyone do their own thing, which of course is what happens in Wikipedia with everyone out there editing the pages themselves. So the governance structure of Wikipedia is really interesting. It's something that's an example to other groups that are trying to form communities online and institutions online that really add meaningful value to the world. So I hope you found this helpful in thinking about how is Wikipedia governed, how does that organization develop structure that leads to so many people trusting its content. And it's a pretty powerful testimony to the power of human collaboration and how organizations can evolve online that actually protect the integrity of information.